The flight to the music festival felt longer than she imagined. She had never been on a plane before, and as it lifted into the sky, her heart raced with both fear and excitement. She looked out the window and saw the city shrinking below her. The same city where she once waited tables, unsure if anyone would ever see her beyond her apron. Now she was on her way to play for an audience she had never met, in a country she had only read about. She thought of the piano waiting for her on that stage. It didn't matter how grand or polished it was. She knew that when she sat down to play, it would be the same as always. Just her, the keys, and the sound that came from her soul. When she landed, the festival organizers greeted her kindly. They handed her a program with the list of performers. The names were from all over the world, people who had studied in the best music schools, who had performed in famous halls, who had agents and sponsors. Her name was there too, written in the same size as theirs. She couldn't help but smile. For once, she wasn't the girl who didn't belong. The city where the festival was held was alive with color and sound. Musicians practiced in hotel lobbies, singers warmed up their voices in corners, and everywhere she looked, there was a kind of creative energy that made her heart beat faster. But as the day of her performance came closer, her nerves returned. She stayed up late the night before, practicing alone in the small room the organizers had given her. She played softly, almost whispering through the music. Every note seemed to remind her of where she had come from. The tiny restaurant, the quiet nights, the smell of food mixing with piano notes. She thought of the faces that had encouraged her, the people who had believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear her teacher's words, "Play from your heart, and you'll never lose your way." The next morning, she woke early and walked to the concert hall. The building was enormous, with tall glass walls and banners fluttering outside. The backstage area was full of movement. Musicians tuning instruments, assistants rushing about, and soft echoes of sound filling the air. She stood quietly, waiting for her turn. A woman from the organizing team approached her and smiled. "You're up next," she said kindly. "Are you ready?" She nodded, though her heart was beating so fast it felt like a drum. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Please welcome our next performer, a pianist whose story has touched hearts around the world." As she walked out under the lights, the crowd greeted her with polite applause. Thousands of faces looked back at her, strangers yet somehow familiar because they were all there for the same reason, to feel something real. She sat at the piano and let her hands rest on the keys. For a moment she didn't play. She just breathed. She thought of that first night, when she was forced to play at a party, scared and humiliated. She remembered the sound of laughter, the way her hands shook, the tears she hid, and then she remembered what happened after, how that one moment of fear had become the doorway to everything that followed. With that thought, she began. The music started softly, a single line of melody that floated like a whisper through the hall. Then it grew, expanding with warmth and power. It wasn't a song she had practiced from sheet music. It was her story, told through sound. Each note carried a memory, a heartbeat, a fragment of her life. The audience listened in silence. Some leaned forward, caught in the emotion. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wrap around them. It was as if time itself had paused to listen. When she reached the final passage, her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. She played the last few notes gently, as if saying goodbye to a chapter of her life. And when the sound faded, the hall was still for a long, breathless moment. Then came the applause. Not just polite, but thunderous, wave after wave of clapping, cheering, standing. She bowed deeply, tears in her eyes. She couldn't believe it, and she had done it. Not for fame, not for validation, but for the girl she once was. The one who had believed she was invisible. After the performance, people came to her backstage. They spoke in different languages, but she could understand their emotions. Some said her music made them cry. Others said it made them remember their own dreams. A famous composer approached her and said, "You reminded me why I started making music in the first place." She didn't know what to say except, "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but her heart felt full. Later that night, when she returned to her hotel room, she sat by the window looking out at the glowing city. Everything felt unreal. The applause, the faces, the lights. But beneath it all, she felt a quiet peace. She knew this wasn't just success. It was freedom. Over the next few months, her name began appearing in newspapers and magazines. Reporters wanted to know her story. How did a simple waitress end up playing on one of the world's biggest stages? Her answer was always the same: because I never stopped playing, even when no one was listening. But fame never changed her. She returned home after the festival and visited the old restaurant again. The piano was still there, though a bit worn from age. The manager smiled when he saw her. "You're a big star now," he said proudly. "Don't forget us, little people." She laughed softly and sat down at the piano. "I could never forget," she said, and began to play. Customers turned their heads. The sound was the same as before, simple, heartfelt, warm. It filled the small restaurant with the same magic it always had. For a few minutes, it felt like nothing had changed at all. Her teacher came to visit her too. He looked older, but his eyes still carried the same spark. "I watched your performance," he told her. "You found your voice," she smiled. "You were right," she said. The heart never forgets where it started. As time went on, she began teaching children how to play. She didn't charge much. Many of them came from humble backgrounds like hers. Some had never even touched a piano before. She taught them not just how to play notes, but how to feel them. "Don't just hit the keys," she told them. "Listen to what your heart wants to say." Her small classroom was always full of laughter and music. Parents often stood outside the door, smiling as they listened to their children play. For her, that was the greatest reward, seeing others discover the same joy that had once saved her. Years passed, and her story continued to inspire people. Documentaries were made about her life, and she was invited to perform at important events around the world. But she always kept one promise to herself: to return home at least once every year and play at the restaurant where it all began. One evening, after finishing a quiet performance there, she sat alone by the piano. The restaurant was empty now, and only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic could be heard. She looked at the old keys under her fingers and smiled. If someone had told her years ago that this would be her life, that she would travel the world, that her music would move people, she would never have believed them. But that was the beauty of it. None of it was planned. It had all started with one moment of courage, one decision to keep playing even when the world seemed to laugh. She pressed a single note, letting it ring out in the quiet room. It was pure, gentle, alive, and in that sound she felt everything: the fear, the struggle, the joy, the gratitude. Her story wasn't about fame or success. It was about faith, in herself, in her music, in the idea that even the smallest voice can be heard if it's honest. As she stood to leave, she turned back once more and whispered, "Thank you," to the piano, to the old friend that had given her everything. The lights in the restaurant flickered softly as she walked out into the night. The air was cool, the stars bright. Somewhere in another part of the city, maybe another girl was sitting alone, wondering if she would ever be seen. And maybe, just maybe, when that girl heard her story someday, she'd believe that she could be more than what the world saw, that even an unseen heart could create something beautiful. Because the truth was simple: she had never just played the piano. She had played her life, and through that she had taught the world that even the quietest souls could make the loudest music. The day of the big event came faster than she expected. It felt like time had quietly run past her while she was lost in practice, rehearsing again and again until her fingers felt like they could move on their own. But no amount of practice could stop the little tremor that ran through her hands as she looked at the invitation one last time. It was the most prestigious event she had ever been asked to perform at, the kind where cameras flashed, reporters waited outside, and every guest seemed to wear confidence like expensive perfume. She stood in front of her mirror, trying to calm her nerves. Her dress was simple, light-colored, and borrowed from a friend. She had never owned anything fancy, but somehow it suited her. Her hair was tied neatly, her shoes shined. She didn't look like a celebrity or a performer, just herself, quietly prepared for something that still felt bigger than her dreams. Her teacher met her outside the venue, his eyes proud but gentle. "Remember," he said softly, "you're not here to impress anyone. You're here to share your heart. That's what makes your music real," she nodded. Those words stayed with her as she walked in. The hall was dazzling. Chandeliers glimmered above. Laughter echoed through the space, and waiters carried trays of crystal glasses that sparkled under the lights. She noticed a few faces from the first party she had ever played at. Some of them were the same people who once laughed when the host made her play. Now, when their eyes met hers, there was no laughter, only curiosity, even respect. Backstage, she could hear the hum of conversation fading as the host took the stage to welcome everyone. "Tonight," he said proudly, "we are honored to have a performer whose story has touched many hearts. You might remember her from a small, unplanned performance months ago. But tonight she returns, not as a waitress, but as a true artist." A wave of applause filled the hall. Her chest tightened as she waited for her cue. She took one last breath and stepped into the light. The crowd was larger than she'd ever faced before. Every table seemed to shine under golden lamps, and the air carried the scent of perfume and fine food. She could feel every heartbeat in her chest, every whisper from the crowd. She sat down at the piano. The instrument gleamed under the stage lights, almost calling to her. For a moment, she closed her eyes. The noise faded. The fear softened. Then she began to play. The first notes were gentle, like a conversation between her and the piano. The melody started small, delicate like a memory trying to form. Then it grew, flowing through the hall like a river finding its course. Her fingers moved with confidence now, guided not by fear but by feeling. Every rise and fall in the melody carried a story. The struggles of long nights at the restaurant, the loneliness, the moment she was forced to play in front of strangers. It was all there, woven into the rhythm. She didn't try to be perfect. She just let her soul speak. Halfway through, she opened her eyes and saw the audience. The same people who once looked at her with amusement now sat frozen, captivated. The room was silent except for her music. Even the servers had stopped moving. The sound of her piano filled every corner, wrapping around the people like a soft embrace. When the last note faded, it left behind a silence so deep that she could hear her own breathing. Then slowly applause began. Soft at first, then louder, stronger, until it became thunderous. People stood up. Some clapped, others cheered, and a few wiped tears from their eyes. She rose, her heart racing, and bowed deeply. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. The same hall where she once stood embarrassed and frightened was now filled with people applauding her. Afterward, as she walked off stage, the host met her with a broad smile. "You've done it again," he said warmly. "But this time no one will ever forget your name." She smiled faintly, too overwhelmed to speak. The man who had once forced her to play had now become the one giving her a chance to shine. Life, she thought, really had a strange way of turning things around. That night, many guests came to meet her. They shook her hand, praised her performance, and asked where she had learned to play like that. Some offered her opportunities, a recording session, a radio appearance, even a small concert tour. She listened politely but didn't say yes to anything right away. Deep down, she wanted to talk to her teacher first. When she found him later, he stood quietly at the edge of the hall, his eyes glistening with pride. "You've done what most people only dream of," he said softly. "But remember, the higher you go, the more important it becomes to stay true to yourself." She nodded. "I don't want to lose what made me start playing," she said. "If I ever stop feeling the music, I'd rather stop playing altogether." He smiled. "Then you'll never lose it." A few weeks later, things began to move faster than she could keep up with. Local news channels invited her for interviews. Articles were written about her. The girl who went from waitress to pianist. The restaurant where she used to work became famous because of her story. People came just to take pictures near the piano she had once played. Despite all the attention, she kept her life simple. She still lived in her small room, still practiced late into the night, and still made time to visit the restaurant. "I started here," she told her coworkers one evening as she sat at the old piano. "No matter what happens, this place will always be home. But fame has a way of testing a person." Offers came with promises of luxury and success, but also conditions. Some people wanted to change her, to make her play songs that didn't feel like her own, to dress differently, to act confident in a way that wasn't natural to her. At first, she tried to please everyone. But with each performance that didn't feel true, something inside her dimmed. She began to miss the simplicity of playing freely, the sound of quiet clapping in small rooms. She didn't want to become a product. She wanted to remain an artist. One evening, she sat with her teacher again, exhausted. "Everything's happening so fast," she said softly. "It feels like I'm losing myself in the noise." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you remember why you played that first time?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Because I couldn't help it. It just came from inside." "Then that's where you'll find your peace," he said. "Go back to that feeling. Forget about the lights, the stage, the cameras. Just play because you love to." His words stayed with her. The next morning, she went to the old restaurant before it opened. She sat at the same piano, touched the same keys, and began to play softly, the way she used to when no one was watching. The melody filled the empty room, tender and real. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. She realized then that success wasn't about how many people watched her, but how honest her heart was when she played. From that day on, she became more careful about the opportunities she accepted. She played at places that valued the soul of music: small theaters, charity events, orphanages, and community gatherings. She wanted her gift to inspire people who needed hope, not just entertain those who already had everything. Months passed, and she became known not just as a pianist, but as someone whose music healed hearts. People said her performances felt like conversations, personal, emotional, and full of warmth. But one letter changed everything again. It arrived one quiet afternoon. The envelope had a gold seal and her name written neatly. Inside was an invitation to perform at an international music festival. It was one of the biggest in the world, featuring artists from many countries. She stared at it in disbelief. Her teacher read it with her. "This," he said softly, "is where your journey has been leading you." She was nervous, but she knew she couldn't let fear decide her life anymore. She had come too far for that. She agreed to perform, not for fame, but to represent every person who had ever been overlooked. Every dreamer who worked quietly in the background. As she packed for the trip, she paused by her piano and touched the keys one last time before leaving. "You started it all," she whispered. "Now let's see where it takes us next." The night before her flight, she looked out her window at the city that had shaped her. The same streets, the same lights, yet everything felt different. She was no longer the girl who had been forced to play in fear. She was someone who had found herself through music, someone who had learned that every struggle could become a song if faced with courage. And as the wind brushed softly through the window, she smiled. She knew the next chapter of her story would test her again, but this time, she was ready to face it. Because she had finally learned that no matter where she went, the piano would always speak for her, honestly, fearlessly, and with all her heart. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to change in ways she never expected. The restaurant where she once blended into the background was now always full. Some people came for the food, but many came just to hear her play. The quiet waitress who once stood unnoticed in a crowd had somehow become the reason people reserved tables weeks in advance. Still, she didn't let the attention get to her head. Every morning she woke up the same way, to the sound of street vendors outside her window, the smell of bread from the bakery below, and the thought that she had to work hard again today. She still tied the same apron around her waist, greeted every customer with the same gentle smile, and helped her coworkers whenever they needed her. She didn't see herself as anyone special, but the world around her saw something different now. The video of her performance at the rich man's party had gone far beyond what she imagined. It was no longer just hundreds of views. It had grown into thousands. Comments came from people in different countries, all praising her gift. They said her music felt real, soulful, from the heart. Some even wrote that her story gave them hope. When she found out, she was stunned. She didn't know how to react to strangers calling her an inspiration. All she had done was play a piano when she was asked to. She never planned for this attention, and in some ways it scared her. But deep down it also warmed her heart. For the first time she realized that something she loved in silence could touch people she had never met. The man who had offered to teach her continued to give lessons whenever she could find time. He was patient, kind, and always pushed her to believe she was capable of more. "You play with emotion," he told her one afternoon. "Now it's time to give your emotion a home inside structure. That's what makes a real artist." She practiced even harder. Sometimes she stayed in the studio long after her teacher left, playing until her hands ached. She wasn't doing it to impress anyone. She was doing it because she finally felt alive. Every key she touched felt like a piece of her soul being freed. One evening, after a long shift at the restaurant, she sat at the piano, tired but unable to resist playing a few notes. The room was empty except for one man sitting quietly in the corner. She hadn't noticed him at first. When she finished, he stood and clapped softly. "That was beautiful," he said. "Do you perform anywhere else?" She shook her head shyly. "No, just here sometimes." He smiled. "You should. I organize events for new musicians. You have something rare, a sound that feels honest. I think people would love to hear you." At first she thought he was joking, but a week later he returned, this time with a flyer. It was for a local cultural event, a charity gala that raised funds for young artists. He told her they needed a pianist to open the show. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready for such a thing, but her teacher encouraged her. "Opportunities knock softly," he said. "If you don't listen, they'll move on." She spent nights practicing, pouring her heart into every note. She didn't have fancy clothes or a confident attitude like professional musicians, but she had sincerity, and sometimes that was enough. When the day of the event arrived, she stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly. The hall was far bigger than the restaurant. Rows of seats stretched out under bright lights filled with people dressed beautifully. She could hear the soft murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses. Her stomach twisted in nervous knots. She peeked through the curtain and saw the audience waiting. For a moment she thought of backing out. "I'm just a waitress," she whispered to herself. "What am I doing here?" Her teacher, who stood beside her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "You're a musician. Go remind yourself of that." When her name was announced, the applause felt distant, almost unreal. She took a deep breath and walked out, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. The piano waited in the center of the stage, shining under the lights. She sat down slowly, her fingers brushing the keys. For a moment, the world around her disappeared. She began to play. The first few notes trembled, like her hands. But soon, the melody took over, steady and graceful. The audience grew still. The soft rise and fall of the music filled the room like a living thing, gentle yet strong, fragile yet full of power. Her music told a story she couldn't tell with words, of long nights, quiet dreams, and small hopes that refused to die. When the final note faded, there was a pause. Then came applause. Loud, genuine, thunderous. People stood, clapping, smiling. Some even had tears in their eyes. She bowed deeply, her heart racing, her cheeks flushed with disbelief. After the event, people came to speak with her. Some offered compliments, others asked questions. A few handed her business cards. "You must record," one said. "You have something special." She returned home that night exhausted but glowing. She sat on her bed, still hearing the echo of the applause. It felt unreal, like a dream she hadn't meant to dream but somehow had stepped into. The next week, she returned to work at the restaurant as usual. Her coworkers cheered for her when she walked in. "Our star pianist," they teased. She laughed shyly and got back to serving, though the joy in her eyes couldn't be hidden. The manager called her into his office later that day. "I got a call from one of the organizers," he said. "They said people were asking about you. Some want to hire you for private events." She blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "Hire me? To play?" He nodded. "Yes, seems your days of just being a waitress might be numbered." She smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." He leaned back in his chair. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to keep doing what you've been doing, playing from your heart. That's what makes you different." More invitations followed. Small events, local gatherings, charity dinners. She accepted them all. Each time she performed, the crowd grew, and so did her confidence. Her teacher began helping her prepare a few original compositions. He said it was time for her to share her own story through music. But through all the attention, she stayed grounded. She still lived in the same small room, still helped her coworkers when the restaurant was busy, and still played quietly late at night when everyone else had gone home. She didn't chase fame. She only followed the music. Then, one evening, as she was cleaning tables after closing, a familiar car pulled up outside. The host from that first party stepped out again. The man who had once made her play in front of strangers. This time his expression was warm. He walked up to her with a smile. "You've come a long way," he said. "I've heard about your performances." She bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir. You were the one who made me play that night." He laughed. "Forced you, more like. But I'm glad I did. You've got something that can't be ignored." He paused, then continued. "I'm hosting another event soon. A big one, with people from across the city. I'd like you to play there, as the main performer." Her eyes widened. "Main performer?" He nodded. "You deserve it." For a long moment she couldn't speak. Part of her was scared of failing, scared of the spotlight. But another part of her, the one that had always played in silence, whispered, "This is what you've been waiting for." She agreed. That night she walked home under a sky full of stars. The city lights shimmered below like tiny reflections of her own heart. She felt nervous but grateful. Every step she took reminded her of how far she had come. From a girl who played alone after work to someone whose music now touched lives. When she reached her little room, she sat at her small window again. The world outside was the same, noisy, ordinary, but inside her, everything was different. She smiled softly and whispered, "Maybe that night wasn't a mistake after all." She didn't know what the next performance would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. No matter how big the stage became, she would always play for the same reason she started. Because music was the language of her soul. And somewhere, deep inside, she could feel that the best part of her story was yet to come. After that unforgettable night, the restaurant slowly started to change. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. More guests began asking for reservations on the evenings she worked. The regulars who once came only for fine dining now came for the soft music that floated through the air. The quiet waitress who once blended into the background had become the gentle heartbeat of the place. Her playing wasn't scheduled at first. Sometimes the manager would ask her to play when the dining room felt a little dull or too quiet. Other times she would start on her own, after noticing that the guests were waiting for her to sit at the piano. She didn't play for fame or money. She played because it made people smile, and that joy filled her in ways nothing else did. The piano itself seemed happier too. The keys, once stiff and dusty, began to shine again. The restaurant owner, hearing about her talent from the host of that big party, had the instrument tuned and polished. "If she's going to play," he said, "the piano should sound its best." Each evening, she tied her apron, served with her usual calm, and then when things slowed down, she would sit at the piano and let her heart speak. Her music was never loud or flashy. It was soft, warm, and full of feeling. The kind of music that made people forget their worries for a while. Soon, people began recording her on their phones. Guests would whisper to newcomers, "Wait until she starts playing, you'll see." Some even posted short clips online. She didn't think much of it at first. To her, it was just people enjoying the moment. But the internet doesn't forget. One morning as she arrived for work, the young waiter who had once pointed her out to the host came running toward her, phone in hand. "You're on the internet," he said, eyes wide with excitement. She looked confused. "What do you mean?" He showed her a video. It was of her playing that night at the grand party, the one that changed everything. The clip had been shared hundreds of times. The caption said something like, "A waitress was asked to play piano at a rich man's party and stunned everyone." Her heart jumped. She couldn't believe people were actually watching her play. The comments were full of kind words and people calling her a hidden gem and a soul that plays with emotion. Some even asked who she was and where they could find her. She didn't know whether to feel proud or embarrassed. The manager saw it too. "You're getting famous," he said with a grin. "We might need to start charging extra for your performances." She laughed nervously. "Please don't say that." "I'm just doing what I love," he smiled. "That's exactly why people love it. But fame, even small, can be strange." Within days, new faces began showing up at the restaurant. Some guests weren't there for the food and they came to see her. They'd whisper to the staff, "Is she playing tonight? Or can we sit near the piano?" At first, it made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to attention. She still wore her simple uniform, still carried trays, still took orders politely. But she couldn't hide anymore. The moment she sat at the piano, cameras would come out. People would lean in closer and the room would fall silent. Despite her nervousness, she played with all her heart. Sometimes she played her own melodies, the ones she'd written quietly in her mind years ago. Stories without words. Other times she played old classics that people loved. And every time she gave a piece of herself to the music. One night as she played, a man approached the manager. He was older, wearing a dark suit, and carried himself with quiet confidence. He watched her intently from his table, hardly touching his meal. When the song ended, he stood and walked over to her. The room watched as he leaned down and said something softly. After he left, she looked dazed. The manager walked up quickly. "Everything all right?"
He asked. She nodded slowly.
"He said he's a music teacher. He wants to help me." The manager raised an eyebrow. "Help you?" "He said he can train me properly," she said, still sounding surprised. "He said my music is raw, but it has soul, and that's something you can't teach." That night, when she went home, she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the man's words in her head. Could she really learn properly? Could she become better than she ever imagined? It felt like a dream too big for someone like her, but she didn't say no. The next morning, she met the man at a small music studio on the edge of the city. It smelled of wood and old sheet music. The walls were lined with pictures of musicians and trophies. He listened to her play and smiled quietly, as though he'd found something precious. "You play with your heart first and your fingers second," he said. "That's rare. Most people do the opposite." He began to teach her simple things. How to read proper notes, how to control her rhythm, how to blend emotion with structure. She practiced for hours every day after work, even when her hands hurt or her eyes felt heavy. The lessons weren't easy, but she loved every moment. For the first time, she wasn't just playing for herself. She was learning what her gift could truly become. At the restaurant, the staff noticed her growing confidence. Her music became smoother, richer, more expressive. The guests could feel the difference, even if they didn't know why. It was as if her soul had found new wings. Then one evening, something unexpected happened again. The host from that first party, the wealthy man who had once ordered her to play, returned to the restaurant. He wasn't alone this time. With him were several well-known people, business figures, local artists, even someone from a music foundation. He greeted her kindly when he saw her.
"You still playing?"
he asked. "Yes, sir," she said with a shy smile. "Good," he replied. "I told my friends about you. They wanted to hear for themselves." That night, the restaurant felt different again, filled with quiet expectation. When she began to play, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The sound of the piano floated like light through water. The guests leaned closer, moved by every note. When she finished, the applause was louder than ever before. People stood, clapping, smiling. The man who had brought his friends turned to the manager and said, "She doesn't belong behind a tray. She belongs on a stage." The words echoed in her mind long after they'd left. She doesn't belong behind a tray. After they were gone, the manager pulled her aside. "You know," he said gently, "maybe they're right. Maybe this is just the beginning for you." She looked down at her hands, the same ones that had once scrubbed dishes and carried plates, now capable of creating something beautiful enough to move people. "I don't know," she said softly. "I never thought this would be my path," he smiled. "Life doesn't ask permission before it changes. It just does." That night, when she walked home, the streets looked brighter. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, and she felt a quiet sense of hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stop now. The music that had once been her secret was now her voice to the world. At home, she sat by her little window again. The same window she used to look out from in silence. Now, instead of loneliness, she felt something new. Possibility. She closed her eyes and imagined playing in a big hall with lights shining softly, and people listening. Not because she was a waitress who played well, but because she was a musician. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe it could happen. And though she didn't know it yet, the next part of her story would take her far beyond that small restaurant. to a stage she had never dared to dream of. The soft sound of her music floated through the grand hall, wrapping around the guests like a warm blanket. For a moment, no one spoke. The same people who had laughed at the idea of a waitress playing piano now sat frozen, watching her fingers move over the keys with unexpected grace. The tune wasn't one they recognized, it wasn't classical or famous, but it carried something real, something that touched the heart. It was simple yet full of feeling, like a story told through sound. The host leaned back slowly in his chair, his earlier impatience fading into surprise. Even the waiters standing by the walls forgot their duties for a while, their eyes fixed on her. The clinking of glasses stopped, the soft chatter disappeared, and all that remained was her music, gentle, honest, and alive. When the last note finally faded into silence, there was a stillness that lasted a few seconds longer than anyone expected. Then came a wave of applause. It started small, then grew louder as the guests rose to their feet. Some clapped with polite smiles, others with genuine emotion. The waitress lifted her head, startled by the sound. She looked around the room, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe the applause was really for her. The host himself began to clap. "Well," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I wasn't expecting that. That was quite something." Her heart was still racing. She stood up from the piano, her hands trembling. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, almost whispering. "Do you know more pieces?" Someone asked from the crowd. "Play another one?" The manager gave her a reassuring nod, though she could see he was just as shocked as everyone else. She sat back down slowly. This time her fear was smaller, her breath steadier. Her fingers found the keys again, and she began another tune, lighter, brighter, something that made a few people smile and sway their heads gently. For the next 15 minutes, she played like she had never played before. It wasn't perfect. A few notes slipped here and there. But no one cared. The beauty of her music wasn't in perfection. It was in the emotion she carried through every sound. By the time she finished, the professional pianist had finally arrived. But even he stood by the door quietly, listening, not daring to interrupt. When she stopped playing, the host walked up to her. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. His tone was no longer sharp or commanding. It carried curiosity, maybe even respect. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I never learned properly," she said. "Just by myself." He frowned slightly. "No teacher?" She shook her head. "No, sir. I just play when I can." The host chuckled softly as if he couldn't believe it. "Well, you certainly can. You've just outshined the musician I paid for tonight." The guests laughed lightly at his comment. He turned toward them and said, "Seems we've found hidden talent among our own staff." She wanted to disappear from the attention. Her cheeks grew warm and she quickly stepped back, lowering her head in respect. The manager smiled proudly, even though he had no idea she could play so beautifully. He whispered to her, "That was incredible. You saved the evening." When the real pianist finally took over, the crowd's excitement had already been captured by her. Though she quietly returned to her work, serving tables as before, people kept stopping her to say how wonderful her playing was. A few guests even asked for her name, but she simply smiled and said it didn't matter. She was just glad they enjoyed it. As the night went on, she worked quietly again, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. Every time she walked past the piano, she glanced at it with a secret smile. For the first time in her life, her music had been heard. It wasn't just background sound anymore. It had meaning. After the guests began to leave and the hall grew quiet, she helped clean the tables as usual. The professional pianist, packing up his sheet music, walked up to her and said, "You play from the heart. That's rare. Don't stop." She nodded shyly, unsure how to respond. When she finally stepped out of the restaurant that night, the city was quiet. The streets were empty, the air cool. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and began walking home. Her body was tired, but her soul felt alive. Every step she took echoed with the memory of applause. She kept thinking, "They clapped for me." In her small room, she sat by the window again, looking out into the dark sky. Her hands still tingled from playing. She could almost hear the piano sound in her head. It was strange how one unexpected moment had made her feel seen, after years of being invisible. The next day, when she arrived at work, everything felt different. Her coworkers greeted her with smiles. The chef, who usually never noticed her, gave her a thumbs up. "You were amazing last night," he said. "I didn't know you had that kind of talent." She smiled awkwardly and thanked him. The same young waiter who had mentioned her name to the host grinned and said, "Told you it would be fine." "You killed it out there." The manager was in a particularly good mood. He came out of his office and said, "That performance was the highlight of the night." The host was very pleased. "He even mentioned you to the owner." She looked up in surprise. "To the owner?" He nodded. "Yes. He said you have real talent and that we should consider having you play sometimes in the evenings." Her heart skipped. "Play, like, for the guests?" "Yes," the manager said. "Maybe once a week, just soft music while people dine. It could be good for the restaurant. And of course you'd be paid extra for it." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. For years she had played for empty rooms, never thinking anyone would ever want to listen. And now suddenly she was being offered a chance to play publicly, not as a servant but as a musician. That night, after her shift ended, she stayed behind again. The piano sat quietly in the corner waiting. She sat down and touched the keys gently, her reflection faint in the glossy surface. She thought about how quickly life could change. Just a day ago, she was a waitress hiding her gift. Now people wanted to hear her play. As she began to play softly, the door opened. The manager walked in, holding his jacket.
Still here?
He asked with a small smile. She stopped and looked up. "Just for a little while," he nodded. "You should keep practicing. Who knows where this could lead?" She smiled and said, "I'm just grateful I didn't embarrass myself." He chuckled. "Embarrass yourself? You made the richest people in the city fall silent." "I'd say that's the opposite." When he left, she kept playing. This time the music was brighter, filled with hope. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for once she wasn't afraid to dream a little. Maybe she could take a few lessons someday or record a song or even play at other places. She didn't know. But the thought of it made her heart race with quiet excitement. The next few days were different. Some of the same wealthy guests returned to the restaurant, and a few recognized her. They smiled warmly when they saw her and mentioned her performance. One woman even asked if she could play again that weekend. The manager agreed. And so once again she sat at the piano, her apron still tied around her waist, and played for a crowd that truly listened. The applause came again, gentle but full of warmth. Each time it happened, she grew a little more confident, a little more alive. But deep inside, she still remained humble. She didn't think of herself as talented or special. She only thought of music as her way of speaking, her way of sharing the part of her heart words couldn't express. She didn't know that the small video one guest had recorded of her first performance was already spreading online, reaching people far beyond the walls of that restaurant. While she worked, cleaned, and served as she always did, her quiet story was already starting to travel through screens and hearts across the city. And soon that small spark of attention would grow into something much bigger, something she never dared to imagine. For now, though, she was content. She played, smiled, and served, unaware that the world outside had begun to whisper her name. The waitress who made the rich fall silent with a piano. She worked quietly behind the counter of a fancy restaurant, the kind where people came dressed in shiny clothes and spoke in calm, careful voices. Every evening she tied her apron around her waist, tucked her hair behind her ears, and moved between tables with a soft smile. She didn't say much, but her eyes always carried warmth, the kind that made customers feel noticed. No one in that place really knew her story. To them, she was just another waitress trying to make a living. She lived alone in a small rented room above a grocery store. It wasn't much, just a bed, a chair, and a little window that looked out over the street. At night, when she returned from work, she would sit by that window listening to the hum of cars passing by. Sometimes she would hum softly too, little tunes she made up without realizing it. But music wasn't just a hobby for her. It was something that lived deep inside her, something she never spoke about to anyone. Back in her childhood, she had found an old piano at her neighbor's house. It was dusty and out of tune, but the sound had fascinated her. She would sneak in whenever she could, pressing keys and memorizing sounds. No one taught her how to play. She learned by listening, by feeling, by guessing which notes fit together. Over the years, her fingers became sure and graceful. When life grew harder and lonelier, the piano became her friend, the only place where she could pour everything she felt. At the restaurant, There was an old, upright piano near the corner of the dining area. It hadn't been played in years. Most days it sat there covered with a sheet collecting dust. But every night after everyone left and the chairs were stacked, she would quietly lift the cover, sit down and play. The sound was soft, almost broken, but she didn't care. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She played for herself, to feel alive again after long, tiring hours of serving others. The music came from her heart, simple but full of emotion, like a secret conversation with herself. Her coworkers sometimes teased her for staying late. They thought she liked to clean extra or that she didn't have anywhere else to go. No one knew she stayed for the piano. She never told them. People around her often talked about money, promotions, or relationships, but she never joined those talks. She didn't dream of being rich or famous. All she wanted was a little peace, and the sound of those keys gave her exactly that. There were days when she wondered what her life might have been if she had learned music properly. She would watch videos of pianists online and feel her chest tighten with longing. Their fingers danced across the keys with such confidence. She would think, maybe if life had been kinder, she could have been one of them. But she always shook that thought away. She couldn't afford to dream big. Reality didn't leave much space for that. Bills needed to be paid, rent was due, and food had to be bought. Dreams didn't pay the price of living. One evening, as she served dinner to a table of well-dressed guests, she overheard them talking about an upcoming private event. They mentioned that the restaurant would be hosting one of the wealthiest families in the city for a grand celebration. The kitchen buzzed with talk about it for days. The staff was told to prepare for the big night. Everything had to be perfect. The manager went around double-checking details, giving sharp instructions, and reminding everyone how important this event was. The guests would include people whose names appeared in magazines and business news. The waitress listened quietly as everyone talked about how nervous they were. She wasn't nervous, though. She was used to pressure. She'd worked through holidays, weddings, and endless late nights. Still, a small part of her wondered what it must feel like to be on the other side of things, to be the one sitting at those tables, dressed in silk and laughter instead of standing beside them with a tray. That night, after closing, she went to the piano again. The restaurant was empty, lights dimmed. She sat there and placed her fingers on the keys. The melody that came out was slow, thoughtful, like she was speaking to the piano about her fears and hopes. The sound filled the quiet room, soft and tender. She didn't know that the cleaning staff near the doorway had stopped to listen. They didn't interrupt, didn't say a word. They just stood there, surprised. None of them had ever heard her play before. When she finished, they clapped softly, smiling. She blushed, quickly closed the piano cover, and said she was only practicing. They didn't press her. But word began to spread quietly among a few workers that the quiet waitress could play beautifully. The following week passed quickly. The night of the big event finally arrived. The restaurant was transformed. Lights glowed softly. Tables were dressed in white linen and golden cutlery shimmered under the chandeliers. Expensive cars stopped outside one after another, bringing in guests dressed in elegance. The smell of perfume filled the air. The kitchen was a storm of movement. Chefs shouting instructions, waiters rushing with trays, everyone trying to stay calm. The waitress moved quietly among them, carrying drinks and appetizers, her mind focused on every small detail. The manager was strict that night, reminding everyone not to make a single mistake. She nodded each time, her expression calm, though her hands trembled slightly from the pressure. She didn't know that something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change the course of her life forever. As the evening went on, the guests began to settle, laughter and conversation filling the air. The event planner approached the manager, whispering something that made his face tighten. The pianist, who was supposed to play background music, had called to say he was stuck in traffic outside the city. He wouldn't arrive for at least another hour. The atmosphere grew tense. Music was a major part of the evening's plan. Without it, the event would lose its charm. The host, a man known for his impatience, looked annoyed. "We need music," he said sharply. "We can't have people sitting in silence." His eyes scanned the room until they landed on the old piano in the corner. "Does that thing even work?" he asked. The manager hesitated. "It works, sir, but we don't have anyone." "Someone must know how to play a few notes," the host interrupted. "Even background tunes will do. It's embarrassing to have no music." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. No one moved. Then one of the younger waiters, trying to be helpful, pointed toward the quiet waitress and said, "She can play, sir." The room turned slightly as several pairs of eyes looked at her. She froze where she stood, her tray trembling slightly. "Me?" she asked softly, almost whispering. The host raised a brow. You? You play piano?" Her throat felt dry. She didn't know what to say. "A little," she managed to answer. "Perfect," he said, waving a hand. "Come then, play something until the musician arrives." "Anything pleasant?" She shook her head quickly. "I can't, sir." "I'm not, it's an order." The manager cut in gently, giving her a pleading look. "Just something soft, please. It'll help calm things down." Her heart pounded. She could feel her hands trembling, her knees weak. She didn't want to do it. The thought of playing in front of so many wealthy strangers made her chest tighten with fear. But she couldn't say no. She put the tray down carefully, wiped her palms on her apron, and took a slow breath. The guests turned their attention toward her, whispering among themselves. Some looked amused. A few smiled, clearly expecting a clumsy performance. The host leaned back in his chair, watching with mild curiosity. She walked toward the piano slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The room seemed too bright, too silent, too big. When she reached the piano, she paused for a moment. Her reflection shone faintly on its polished surface. She could hear her heart beating in her ears. For a second, she wished she could disappear. But something inside her, that quiet courage she always carried, whispered that she'd faced worse things in life than a room full of strangers. She sat down, straightened her back, and placed her fingers on the keys. The air in the room shifted. The guests waited, some whispering, others sipping their drinks, ready to be entertained. Or disappointed. She closed her eyes and took another breath. For a moment, she thought about all the nights she had played alone, when no one listened. She thought about the dusty piano, her tiny room, her silent dreams. Then gently her fingers began to move. The first notes were soft, shaky. But as the melody grew, her nerves began to fade. The sound filled the room like a quiet wind. Conversations slowed, laughter faded, and heads began to turn. The light shimmered against the piano, and for a moment, it was as if the world around her disappeared, leaving only her and the music. The waitress, who once went unnoticed, was now the center of everyone's attention. And though she didn't know it yet, that night, that single, trembling performance, would soon become the doorway to a life she never dared to imagine.